We are starting a new unit today about the Canterbury Tales. And before we get started reading the story, we just want to give you some background information about the historical period that began in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings. And that is some important background for the story that we are about to read. So, hopefully, you watched the silly video to remind you about the Battle of Hastings and how it brought the French language influence into the English language. Here's some more background featuring several bizarre men and their bizarre mustaches. First, we have Edward the Conqueror. He was the King of England of Anglo-Saxon England from 1042 until 1066. When he died in 1066, it caused a huge problem. He died without an heir to the throne, meaning that there was no one like his son to directly inherit being the king. To make problems worse, he had promised the throne to multiple people. They were relatives and close to relatives. And so many different people were trying to claim the throne, two important people in particular. Harold Godwinson, who was the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor, had what he felt was the top claim to the throne. And so he got the throne. Because he was an Anglo-Saxon king himself, the leaders of the time decided that Harold would get the throne. He became Harold II, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England. But this was a problem because despite his amazing mustache, Harold had some enemies across the sea. William the Conqueror, who was the leader of Norman France, had also been promised the throne by Edward the Confessor. Here's William the Conqueror with a far less impressive mustache. William the Conqueror was the first Norman king of England. The Normans were from France, they spoke French, and so when he brought his army across the sea, they landed in Hastings, England, which is why it's called the Battle of Hastings, and they defeated the Anglo-Saxon army. And this brought French influence into England. And the English are still mad about it. Here's more details about the Battle of Hastings. So the Anglo-Saxons were the English, led by Harold II, and the Normans, or the French, were led by William the Conqueror. The Anglo-Saxons were crushed by the Normans. The Normans won without a doubt. I like this picture over here of Harold Godwinson, who was, according to legend, shot in the eye with an arrow. And so now the Norman era has begun, and this brings a lot of French influence into the language. And so Old English is now becoming Middle English because of this French influence. And the stories that we are now going to start reading, the Canterbury Tales, Le Morte d'Arthur, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, these were all written in Middle English. Now, it still does not sound quite like the English that we recognize, nor does it look like the English that we recognize. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, which we will be reading in the next class period. And so what it's really saying is, when April, with his showers sweet, the draft of March has pierced to the root, and it's going to even sound even better than this in our translation. But if you look over here on the left-hand side, you see that there are some letters still that we don't really use. There are words like vertu and eke and holt that are still not words that we would use, but they're starting to get a lot closer. You can see that this is tender crops, the young sun, the small fowls, meaning birds, are making melody. So the birds are singing. And so it's starting to look a lot more like the language that we speak. Now let's see what it sounds like. Well, this is supposed to be playing a video of what it sounds like. Let's Let's try something different. Here we go. That's my favorite line. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimages. Because that brings us to the point of our story that our characters in the Canterbury Tales are going on a pilgrimage. But we will talk more about what that means in our next lesson. So now let's go back and find out a little bit more about society in Chaucer's time, because this gives us our social structure for the stories that we are about to read. And the activity that you're doing next is closely connected to feudalism. So once the Normans took over in England, they solidified their own form of government called feudalism. And it's really the social order. So this structure, which we'll look at a pyramid shape of it in just a minute, is generally based around the idea that the different groups of society would exchange land for service or labor. So the wealthy people owned the land, the poor people worked the land, and in exchange, the wealthy people would protect the poorer people, and the poor people would provide food for the wealthy people. So it's a system of exchanges where land is equivalent to wealth and power. And so it can be viewed as this pyramid of power. You can think of it as that stretches from the king at the tippy top to the peasants at the bottom. And it might look like this. So here we have the king at the very top, and he rules the entire kingdom. He owns all the land, and the rest of the land is divided up between the nobles and the church. The church gets 25% of the land, and 50% of it goes to these barons or nobles. And so if you have a mathematical mind, you can kind of picture it like a pie chart at this point. The whole idea is the whole land belongs to the king, and he gives some of it to his nobles. The nobles, in return, swear allegiance to the king, and they have the right to build castles and protect their own piece of land. And then they are also to supply the king with knights for his protection. So some of the knights who live on this noble's land are pledged to go fight in the king's army. And it is the job of the nobles to govern the land that these people below them live on. So the knights then are there to serve the king, the lords, the people, and God, and to protect the kingdom. That's their job. They're kind of in between the free peasants and the nobles, because these knights are usually pulled from the sons of the nobles, or maybe some especially lucky sons of the merchants and serfs. And eventually the knights are going to inherit some of this land. The knights are going to end up getting titles, like being called an earl or a duke, and that is how they are going to get land and kind of move up this social pyramid. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot of movement in this pyramid. Underneath the knights, you have the free peasants, and you can see that this is kind of a very small sliver. In the Middle Ages in particular, this was a very small group of people. They provided goods and services that were not farming for the most part. Some of them may have owned enough land to farm for themselves, but what they provided to the Lord in exchange for the place where they were living and the place where their shop was held was whatever their service or skill might have been. So they might have been a blacksmith, or they might have been a dressmaker or a shoemaker. They might have been a cart mender. They could be a keeper of the horses. These are tasks that might have been assigned to people who are not just serfs who live on the land and work for the land. And this class is going to later become the middle class, but right now they're still part of the lower class, barely above the serfs and bound peasants. Notice that it says approximately 90% of the population, and those are almost all conquered Anglo-Saxons, became these serfs and peasants who then live on this land that they don't own. They work for the Lord. They don't get paid, and they do not own the land that they're on. So they are paying their rent basically by giving the Lord the majority of what they grow on their land, or the animals that they tend on the land. And that is how they make their living. And in exchange, some of the food they are allowed to keep. And the noble is responsible for taking care of, their house and their land and protecting them by also sending these knights to defend them from foreign invasion. So pretty complicated feudal pyramid here. But we are going to do an activity next that will give you maybe a better understanding of this by putting this feudal pyramid into the perspective of some social systems you're more familiar with. Before we do that, though, make sure you go to the quiz on MS Forms to get credit for having gone through this PowerPoint and answer the questions.